Welcome to the fifth part of making a catsuit, sewing. Pin the body's back seam from crotch to nape with pins parallel to the edge, on top and pointing in the same direction. Sew with the points away from you so you can easily remove the pins by the head before they reach the needle, and sewing slowly enough that you can guide the edges under the needles. Notice that the silver on the outside of the suit is facing itself. This is termed right sides together. The heel starts and ends at the ankle notches you cut in the fabric. I forgot to film sewing that, but it's much like doing the toes, which you'll see shortly. Fold the leg with right sides together, then align the edges using the notches you cut to match accurately. These are the calf notches. The heel seam started and stopped at its own ankle notches, so the ends of that seam will match up the ankle notches for this edge. Between each pair of notches, pin along every couple of inches, aligning all the pins in the same direction all the way from one foot to the other. Take particular care anywhere the curves aren't exactly the same between two notches. If you eliminated the center front seam, you'll need to spread any difference evenly and will need to pin more frequently. Start the leg seam an inch above the outside ankle notch, as I do here, so you'll be sewing along a fold at first. Try to have the heel seam pinned flat and perpendicular so this new seam isn't stressed where they meet. Work carefully around the toes. Sometimes I turn the machine by hand if I want to go particularly slowly. See that I'm stopping frequently to lift the foot and check both layers of the fabric, so the needles will always catch the edges. If I want to pivot or anchor while I turn the cloth, I'll leave the needles down. If I want to work freehand, I'll have the needles up. You'll notice I'm sometimes pulling the edges into position with dressmaking tweezers, for which there are a couple of reasons. The boring one is that I didn't cut the toe edges quite accurately, so they don't match as well as they should. The more interesting reason is that layers of velvet tend to creep while folded right sides together, because the first slides easily in the direction of stroke, but wedges when pushed against the direction of stroke, and I found that tweezers are a much more efficient counterweapon to creep than lots of pinning, even with accurately cut toes. When you reach the inside ankle notch, it should be aligned with the other end of the heel seam. Remember that you should have the heel seams pinned flat and perpendicular when you sew across it. I trim the heel seams thread here so it doesn't get caught in the serger's mechanism. Once past the ankle, just continue up the leg to the crotch. Remember to move the garment around if the part you've sewn or the part you've yet to sew is pulling or the feeding of your seam in the wrong direction or getting in the way. I've managed to sew completely the wrong things together before now because I caught hold of something in the wrong place. If you've eliminated the center front seam, then at the crotch you'll be trying to sew a straight edge on one layer of fabric to a sharp U-shape on the other, and will need to use tension to pull the tip of the U into the path of the machine's needles as you sew. Normally I'll use a needle and thread to pull a single loop through the cloth at the tip of the U so I can tug it into place while the machine is sewing that part of the edge into the seam, and slip the thread free once it's gone through, but for some weird reason I did it here with the tweezers and foot pressure. Notice how I have the needles down to keep the tip of the U, which is under tension, in place while I fiddle. Once past the crotch, I just sew down to the ankle, around the toes and back up the outside of the foot, past the final ankle notch, and sew along the fold for an inch or so. I'm using a special sewing machine called a serger or overlock machine, but you can use a zig-zag stitch on a conventional machine. Use stitches 3mm long and 3mm wide, sewing about 1mm or 2 in from the edge, and then re-sew the seam again with zigzag for strength. Reach inside the garment and run your finger along the stitching, feeling for holes or kinks, which are small folds caught into the seam. Check visually as well, making sure the sewing captures both edges with all the stitches. If you find a kink or gap, you should unpick a short section of seam using a seam ripper and re-sew it, because either will weaken the seam. For gaps, it's sometimes sufficient just to re-sew that part of the seam a little further in without unpicking. The crotch needs particularly careful inspection because it's under the most tension. Take a sleeve and find its front raglan curve, one with a single notch. Now find the corresponding sleeve curve on the body piece. Align the notches and pin them right sides together. Pin the rest of the curve and then sew. Repeat for the other sleeve. Take a half sleeve piece and find its raglan curve. Match it to the body's raglan, pin it with right sides together and dual notches aligned, then sew. Much as for the front raglan curve I just did. The yoke, that's the piece at the nape of the neck, was supposed to be cut on a fold, but I cut it out as two pieces instead, so I'm just sewing them together. Now lift the chest and sleeve piece, locate the rear raglan curve of the full sleeve, these curves also have 2 notches, and align those notches with the ones for the yoke. Pin them with right sides together, Align the ends of the curves and pin all along. Now sew each curve and repeat for the other sleeve. Here I've cut a long rectangle of fabric 2 inches wide and the full width of the cloth, and I'm pinning it in half lengthways. Here I'm sewing along it with wrong sides together, silver outermost, to form a tube called a casing. This will turn into the collar and will hold the elastic along the overlap. The next seam runs along the shoulder dart edge of the half sleeve between the big arrow and the bit that was cut off in the last video. Then across the top of the body's back piece and along the other sleeve's shoulder dart. I pin the casing seam along that edge, right sides together, and sew. Then trim the casing to leave an inch or so on either end. Next I pin the casing along the lower curve of the yoke from armpit to armpit, also leaving a little extra on either end. Laying out to show you. That silver band is the casing to the lower curve of the yoke. I lay the back piece out on top, remember this will end up inside, and you can see how the half sleeves match up with the full sleeves, and how the top casing will run from shoulder to shoulder behind the neck. See that it ends up nicely flat. Now I thread elastic through the yoke underarm casing, and then untwist it so it's flat. Here I sew the long seam of the sleeve closed, from underarm to cuff, catching the yoke's casing and the lower edge of the half sleeve. I do this in 2 stages. Firstly, I fold the full sleeve along its central edge, which matches up its long edges, but also aligns the yoke's remaining unsewn edge along the slash on the body piece that dropped from where its front and back raglan curves met. I pin the yoke's unsewn edge and its casing and elastic along the front body side of the slash, then sew to hold them in place for the next stage, where I sew the half sleeve on top. For the second stage, I lay the half sleeve on top, its underarm matching the full sleeve's underarm, and sew from an inch below the underarm slash to catch some fold, as with the ankle, turning the garment at the underarm, and continuing the sleeve all the way to the cuff. Starting the sewing below the slash, where the fabric is folded, reduces strain on the start of the sleeve. I repeat this for the other side. Now for the final sleeve seam. I thread elastic through the back shoulder casing, making sure it's not twisted, and then lay the sleeves out flat and align the half sleeves on top. Note I forgot to cut the notch at the big arrow that would have helped me align the half sleeve with the full sleeve's dart, don't you forget. Pin the dart incorporating the half sleeve and the casing, and then sew the dart from an inch below the point, in sewing along folded cloth as with the ankle, to the neckline, securing the half sleeve to the full sleeve, and the half sleeve's casing and its elastic at the point of the dart. I would encourage you to sew the dart closed first and then sew the half sleeve on top, so you're only dealing with 2 edges at a time. Repeat for the other sleeve. Finally, the collar. Cut a length of the remaining casing to match the neckline's length, unpick its ends and sew them to make a loop. Arrange that around the neckline, pinning in halves, quarters, then eighths. Remember to pin parallel to the edge, pointing in the same direction and on the same side of the fabric so they're easy to remove while you sew. To get in, pull it up to your shoulders with your arms inside, tuck your head through the neckline, then ease your arms into the sleeves. To get out, draw the neckline up your head halfway, then reach behind to pull the yoke casing over your head. Pull the sleeves from the shoulder.